You have to pay this contract!
I never agreed to $74,000.
You are being completely ungrateful!
I am not paying for this.
My own mother forged my signature on a $74,000 wedding contract. And when I found out and refused to pay a single dollar of it, my family sat me down and told me I was the ungrateful one. Not her. Me. The daughter whose identity was stolen. By the end of this story, one of them will be facing fraud charges, another will disappear from my life completely, and I will be the one standing at the altar with a wedding I actually chose. If you've ever been called the villain for refusing to clean up someone else's mess, this story is for you. Please stick with me until the end, because the way this family turned on me is only the beginning. My name is Harper Whitfield, and 3 weeks before my wedding, I found out my own mother had signed my name on a $74,000 contract without telling me. When I refused to pay it, my family stood in my living room and called me a selfish, ungrateful daughter who didn't deserve a wedding at all. If you think that's the worst part of this story, please stick with me, because what my family did next is the reason I'm sitting here today, completely at peace, while 3 of them can't show their faces at a single family gathering. It started 8 months earlier, the night I got engaged to Nathaniel Reyes. My mother, Diane Whitfield, had always been what people politely call involved. She threw herself into wedding planning the way other people train for a marathon, obsessively, and without asking if I actually wanted a running partner. First I thought it was sweet. She'd raised me alone after my father left when I was 9, and I figured this was her chance to finally get the wedding she never had. I let her tag along to a few venue tours. I let her weigh in on flowers. I did not, at any point, give her permission to sign anything on my behalf. But that's exactly what she did. My mother walked into Ashford Manor, a luxury venue 2 hours outside the city, met with their event coordinator, and put down a deposit using a credit line she opened using my social security number. Information she still had from years earlier when she used to help me with taxes. She booked the venue, the catering, the florist, and a wedding planner named Priscilla Vaughn, all under contracts that listed me as the responsible party, all without a single phone call to me first. I found out by accident. A collections notice arrived at my apartment for a florist deposit I never authorized. When I called the number on the letter, confused, the woman on the phone read off a contract with my name, my signature, forged, and a total balance due of $74,000. I sat on my kitchen floor for 20 minutes just staring at the paper before I called my mother. When I called my mother, I expected panic and apology something. Instead, she sighed like I was the one being difficult. "Harper, I did this for you," she said. "Every mother wants to give her daughter a dream wedding. You should be thanking me." I told her that forging my signature wasn't a gift, it was fraud, and that I wanted every contract canceled immediately. She laughed, actually laughed, and told me I was overreacting. That's when I learned my sister, Kayla Whitfield, and my mother's boyfriend, Roger Callahan, had been in on it from the start. Roger, who had been dating my mother for 3 years and inserted himself into every family decision like he'd been there since my birth, had actually co-signed one of the contracts, claiming he was my stepfather to the venue coordinator, even though he and my mother weren't married. Kayla had helped pick the flowers and the menu, fully aware the whole time that none of it was authorized by me. I called a family meeting, thinking if I laid out the legal reality calmly, they'd understand the severity. Instead, I walked into my mother's living room to find all 3 of them sitting together like a united front, arms crossed, waiting for me. My mother spoke first. "We already gave the venue our word. Do you understand what it would do to this family's reputation if you back out now?" Reputation. Not my finances. Not my identity theft. Reputation. I explained slowly that I hadn't backed out of anything because I was never in. I hadn't signed a single form. Kayla rolled her eyes and said, "God, Harper, it's not that deep. It's a wedding. Just let Mom have this." Roger added that I should be grateful someone in this family finally has good taste. Nobody apologized. Nobody offered to help pay. They simply expected me to absorb a $74,000 debt, because objecting to it made me the villain of the story they'd already written in their heads. Word spread through the family fast, and not the way I expected. Within 2 days, my Aunt Linda texted me a paragraph about how blessed I should feel that my mother cared so much. My cousin Danielle called to ask why I was punishing Mom for loving me too much. Nobody asked if the contracts were forged. Nobody asked how a florist deposit ended up on a collections notice with my legal name on it. The story that had been passed around wasn't the truth. It was the version my mother told first, and she made sure she told it fast. In my mother's version, I was an ungrateful daughter who threw a tantrum over a generous gift. She left out the forged signature. She left out the identity theft. She left out that she'd never once asked me what kind of wedding I wanted before booking $74,000 worth of decisions I had no part in. By the time I tried to explain my side, half the family had already decided I was being dramatic, difficult, and cold toward a mother who only wanted to help. Nathaniel, my fiancé, was the only person who didn't need convincing. He'd been there when I found the collections letter. He'd watched me shake through that phone call. He sat beside me at the family meeting and heard Roger call me ungrateful with his own ears. But even he underestimated how far my mother was willing to take this narrative. She started telling people that Nathaniel was pressuring me to cut off my own mother, painting him as the outsider poisoning a loving family, when in reality he was the only person in my life not trying to guilt me into paying a debt I never agreed to. I went to a lawyer that week, a woman named Counselor Renata Ibarra, who specialized in fraud and identity theft cases. I laid every document on her desk: the forged signature, the credit line opened in my name, the venue contract, all of it. She looked up at me after 20 minutes of reading and said one sentence that changed everything. "Harper, what your family did to you isn't a family disagreement. It's a felony." Counselor Ibarra explained the reality plainly. Someone had opened a credit line using my social security number without my consent, and that alone qualified as identity theft under state law. The forged signature on the venue contract was a separate, provable offense, since Ashford Manor had a copy of my actual signature on file from a tour I'd attended months earlier, and it looked nothing like the signature on the contract. I hadn't broken any laws. My mother had. I asked her what my options were, half hoping there was some quiet way to make this disappear without destroying my family. She was honest with me. I could report the identity theft to the police and the credit bureaus immediately to protect my credit, regardless of what I decided to do about pressing charges against my mother personally. Reporting the fraud to protect myself financially didn't require me to decide, that day, whether I wanted my own mother arrested. Those were two separate steps, and the first one wasn't optional if I wanted my name off that $74,000. So I filed the identity theft report. I disputed the credit line. I sent formal letters to Ashford Manor, the caterer, and the florist explaining that I had never authorized any of the contracts bearing my forged signature, and requesting they cancel everything and pursue the actual signer, my mother, for any penalties. Ashford Manor's coordinator was stunned when I explained the situation. She pulled the original signature from my earlier venue tour and confirmed, on record, that it didn't match the one on the contract. While all of this was happening quietly through lawyers and paperwork, my mother, Kayla, and Roger were still telling anyone who'd listen that I was the problem. They had no idea that behind the scenes, Counselor Ibarra was building a case. The venue was preparing to void every contract and reissue the debt notices to the actual signer, and the reputation my mother was so desperate to protect was about to be shattered by her own decisions. 2 weeks after I filed the identity theft report, Ashford Manor's coordinator called my mother directly to inform her the contracts were being voided due to signature fraud, and that the outstanding balance, along with a potential fraud penalty, would now be pursued against her, not me. My mother called me screaming before I'd even had my morning coffee. "Do you understand what you've done? They're saying I committed a crime, Harper. Do you want to see your own mother in jail?" I asked her calmly if she understood that forging my signature and opening a credit line in my name was in fact a crime regardless of who reported it. She didn't answer that. Instead she pivoted, the way she always did, to how humiliated she was, how everyone would find out, how I'd chosen a stranger's opinion of a florist over my own mother's love. Roger got on the phone next, trying a different tactic, threatening that he'd tell Nathaniel's parents I came from an unstable family if I didn't drop everything and let my mother handle the balance her own way, which it turned out meant asking Nathaniel and me to quietly absorb half the debt to keep the peace. Kayla was the one who surprised me most. She showed up at my apartment uninvited, mascara running, telling me that Mom had been manipulating her too, that she'd only picked the flowers because she didn't know the whole thing was fraudulent, and that she was scared her name might be tied to it since she'd been present at some of the vendor meetings. For a moment I softened toward her. Then she asked me to tell the lawyer she had nothing to do with it. Even though I had text messages from her discussing menu options weeks after the fake credit line had already been opened. I didn't lie for her. I told Counselor Ibarra everything, including Kayla's involvement, and let the facts speak for themselves instead of picking sides based on tears. Ashford Manor's fraud department moved faster than any of us expected, because the venue had photographic proof from my earlier tour showing my genuine signature next to the forged one on the contract, and because the credit line paperwork had my mother's fingerprints all over the notarization process. The investigation didn't take long to point squarely at her. The florist and caterer followed suit once they saw Ashford Manor's findings, voiding their contracts and formally naming Diane Whitfield as the party responsible for the debt. Once the paper trail became undeniable, the family narrative flipped overnight, not because people suddenly cared about the truth, but because it became impossible to keep pretending I was the villain. Aunt Linda sent a much shorter, much less confident text asking if it was really that serious. My cousin Danielle didn't call again at all. The people who'd spent weeks calling me ungrateful went quiet the moment the word fraud investigation became attached to my mother's name instead of mine. My mother's response wasn't remorse. It was rage. She told anyone who would still listen that I had destroyed the family by refusing to just quietly pay off a debt that wasn't mine, as if protecting myself from a felony was somehow the greater crime. Roger, facing his own scrutiny for co-signing as a stepfather he had no legal standing to claim, distanced himself from my mother almost immediately, leaving her to face the fallout largely alone, which I think stung her more than anything else that happened. Nathaniel and I sat down one evening, just the two of us, and I finally let myself cry. Not out of guilt but out of grief for the mother I thought I had. He held me and reminded me of something simple. Refusing to pay for someone else's crime isn't betrayal. It's self-respect. Diane was formally charged with identity theft and fraud, and while I wasn't the one pressing for the harshest possible outcome, I also didn't lift a finger to soften what was already in motion. She hired her own lawyer, spent money she didn't have on legal fees, and ultimately reached a settlement that required her to pay back every vendor directly and complete a diversion program to avoid jail time, alongside a permanent mark on her record. The $74,000 that was once hanging over my head vanished from my name entirely, replaced by a paper trail that made it undeniably clear who was responsible. Roger, once so quick to call me ungrateful, disappeared from my mother's life within the month once he realized dating someone under a fraud investigation wasn't the image he wanted either. Kayla, despite dodging any formal charges since she hadn't signed anything herself, lost something else: my trust, permanently, once I realized she'd been more concerned with protecting her own image than telling the truth when it counted. The family gatherings that used to revolve around my mother's opinions got quieter. Some relatives, embarrassed by how quickly they turned on me, tried to reach out with awkward apologies. I didn't owe anyone forgiveness on a timeline, and I didn't rush to hand it out. What I did instead was pour my energy into planning an actual wedding, small, honest, and completely free of anyone who thought loyalty meant staying silent while I was defrauded. Nathaniel's parents, who I'd worried might judge me after Roger's threats, ended up being some of the kindest people through the entire ordeal. They never once made me feel like my family's actions reflected on me, and they were the ones who helped me find a modest venue, one with contracts I signed myself with my own handwriting for the very first time. Planning my actual wedding after everything felt strange at first, like I was tiptoeing around joy I hadn't fully earned back yet. But slowly, choosing every detail myself, the small venue, the simple flowers, the short guest list, started to feel less like planning a party and more like reclaiming something that had been stolen from me the moment my mother decided her vision mattered more than my consent. I invited very few people from my extended family. Aunt Linda made the cut, mostly because she quietly apologized without making excuses for anyone else's behavior. Kayla did not out of spite, but because I genuinely didn't trust her judgment anymore. And a wedding isn't the place to test that theory. My mother wasn't invited either, a decision that took me weeks of therapy sessions to feel solid about, but one I never regretted once I made it. Word got back to me that my mother told people I'd banned her out of cruelty, but by then, most of the family already knew the real story, and her attempts to rewrite it again fell flat. There's only so many times you can play victim after a fraud conviction before people stop believing the performance. The wedding itself was small, warm, and entirely mine. Nathaniel's best man gave a speech about resilience that had half the room in tears. My father, who I hadn't been close with growing up, flew in and walked me down the aisle, and for the first time in months, I felt like the story of my life was finally being written by me in my own signature, instead of forged by someone else's hand. Almost a year later, my mother reached out asking to reconnect, framing her actions as a symptom of loving me too much, a phrase that told me she still hadn't fully grasped what she'd done. I met her once at a coffee shop, mostly for closure rather than reconciliation. I told her plainly that forging someone's signature isn't love, it's control, and that I needed her to understand the difference before we could rebuild anything real. She cried, apologized in pieces, but still slipped in comments about how none of this would have happened if I just let her handle things her way from the beginning. I realized, sitting across from her, that some people don't apologize for what they did, they apologize for the consequences of getting caught. I left that conversation without slamming any doors shut completely, but without illusions either. Roger never resurfaced. Kayla reached out sporadically, usually when she needed something, and our relationship settled into a distant, cordial version of what it used to be, sisters in name, not in trust. I don't know if that will ever change, and I've made peace with the possibility that it won't. What surprised me most was how many relatives quietly thanked me later for not backing down. Aunt Linda admitted she'd been afraid to challenge my mother for years, and watching me refuse to be bullied into paying a fraudulent debt gave her the courage to set her own boundaries with people in her life. Betrayal, it turns out, has a way of revealing who is always watching, waiting for someone brave enough to go first. 2 years later, I still think about that afternoon on my kitchen floor, staring at a collections notice with my forged signature on it. More than I probably should. But I don't think about it with fear anymore. I think about it as the moment I stopped confusing obligation with love. My mother taught me, without meaning to, that family loyalty isn't supposed to mean absorbing someone else's crimes just to keep the peace. Nathaniel and I are coming up on our 2nd anniversary. Our marriage started under strange, painful circumstances, but it also started with total honesty between us, which is more than I can say for the family I grew up in. We talk about that period sometimes, not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet gratitude that it revealed exactly who deserved a place in our lives and who didn't. My mother and I speak occasionally, carefully, at a distance that feels safe rather than warm. Kayla and I exchange holiday messages, nothing more. Roger is a name I rarely think about at all. And somewhere in all of that loss, I found something I didn't expect. A version of peace that doesn't require everyone's approval, just my own. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone sitting where I once sat, staring at a debt that was never theirs to carry, it's this: being called ungrateful by people who wronged you isn't a verdict, it's a deflection. You're allowed to refuse to pay for someone else's betrayal, even when they wear a familiar face. Especially then.